Welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. Welcoming back one of our favorite guests, David French. David, thanks for coming back. By the way, this episode should have a trigger warning for certain people. Right.
Oh, my.
Well, not have a trigger. People, I just want to warn people, there may be opinions that you will hear on this podcast that you disagree with, but we never promised you a safe space. Is that right, David? I mean, so.
That's right. That's right. And thanks for having me back, Charlie. I really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Well, I want to start off with something kind of surprising yesterday. The president of the United States had this to say about communism.
Communism is a failed system, universally failed system. And I don't see socialism as a very useful substitute, but that's another story.
Okay, wait. I was reliably assured that this was a president who would never break bad on communism, and that if he became president, we would live in a socialist America. So I am very confused, David.
Well, people keep forgetting that he ran and won the Democratic primary by running against socialism and running against the socialist candidate. I thought that aside was really interesting. I mean, condemning communism is something that's only going to anger about, 19 people on Twitter. But when throwing in that aside about socialism, which, I don't know if it's on script or off script or whatever, was kind of interesting. And I was glad to see it, along with, some of the other things he said, like trying to restore internet to Cuba, to Cubans.
Yeah.
I thought that was good. But that was a great ringing condemnation of communism with an intriguing and interesting aside about socialism that, might have some ripple effects. We'll see.
Well, I want to talk with you today about a number of things, including all of the things we're learning about the possibility of a coup before the inauguration. I also want to talk about this ongoing, very frustrating debate about critical race theory. But I wanted to start off with a piece that you wrote for The Dispatch, which, as I mentioned before we started the podcast, I've really been thinking a lot about. And there's been a lot written about the polarization and the tribalization of our politics, why it has become so shrill and so extreme. And you had a very interesting take, talking about it as perhaps a product of the loss of friendship, loneliness, but particularly among men, that men just don't have friends anymore. So connect the dots for us here.
Yeah.
How does not having friends lead to Twitter screeds?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the data is pretty shocking. Between 1990 and 2021, the percentage of men with no close friends went from 3%, very small percentage, to 15%. The percentage of people with a great deal of close friends went from 40 all the way down to 15. And my theory, and also informed by Damon Linker as well, is that, look, people need relationship. Okay, these are not optional. Relationship and community are not sort of optional things. Now, there are some people who are loners. All the loners out there, we see you, we know you're out there. But most of us, we need relationship. And if it is not arising organically out of your life, in other words, if you're in your day-to-day life, these relationships that sustain you, they sort of help you get through tough times. They really provide that source of joy and stability. Then we start to look for it in other ways, including online with these, affinity relationships or faction relationships, where you're finding people of common interest. Now, that's all well and good, but those kinds of relationships turn out to be more fragile. So if you're in a factional relationship, what is it that binds you? What is it that bonds you? It's your common dedication to the cause. And so there's no tolerance for disagreement, because that faction is the basis of the friendship. I wrote that faction friendships can be even dangerous. They provide community and a sense of purpose, but a lot of the times that purpose is false, and the friendship itself is fragile. They depend on an extraordinary degree of agreement and conformity. And Charlie, I know you and I have experienced this in spades. You can have had years of relationship working with somebody in politics or activism, and then it's over in a blink of a tweet. Because why? The foundation of the friendship wasn't actually mutual love and respect. It was mutual commitment to the same cause. And when you have that, that is where the sort of extremism, because that's the basis of the friendship, is the commitment to the cause, conspiracy theory, that sort of shared commitment to even sort of deeper and more radical beliefs they flourish in that atmosphere. And one of the things I said is, you just can't fact check, plead, or argue. That's the reason why you can't fact check, plead, or argue a person out of a conspiracy, because what you're actually doing is trying to fact check, plead, or argue them out of their community.
Yeah, this is the key point, is that a lot of these arguments are about belonging. And if you don't have any real friends, this is the world you live in. And you're not going to say something or believe something if it means you're going to be excommunicated for most of us. Right. So you mentioned, I'm looking at your piece right now, talking about, friendships built up through years of engagement in politics and activism vanished in the blink of a tweet. You're not with us, then we're not with you. Well, of course, it turns out those were not real friendships. And that is the key thing, because you contrast that with robust family relationships and deep friendships that aren't so fragile. And you tell a story about one of your acquaintances' friends named Leo. That you use as sort of the counterpoint to this. So this is somebody. So tell me about Leo. And why you were actual friends who were able to disagree as opposed to the faction friends.
Yeah. So when I landed in Iraq at Forward Operating Base Caldwell in November of 2007, Captain Leo Broadhead was sitting there waiting for me, and I was the only reservist in an active duty unit. So already I'm sort of isolated because they're suspicious of me. There's, some of the active duty folks don't necessarily think that the reservists are up to par. And then I was the lawyer. I was the JAG officer in a combat arms unit. And so they're going to look at you all the more suspicious because of that. But Leo did not look at me in that way. He knew I was going to be an outsider. He knew I was going to be somewhat isolated, at least for a while. So when he did the room assignments in our officers' quarters, he assigned me to be his roommate, and immediately established a connection. And we are about as different as you can be. I'm a Southern evangelical conservative. He is a Mexican-American immigrant, and he calls himself former Catholic, former Mormon agnostic. He, at the time, especially, I was a partisan Republican trying to get Mitt Romney. I was working, my wife was actually on the campaign bus with the Romneys at that time. And I was, I was deployed, so I wasn't doing anything political, but I wanted Romney to win. He was all in for Barack Obama. But, we formed a relationship around mutual respect, a shared, very, very difficult experience. And the differences that we had weren't a cause of friction, actually, in the relationship. They're actually a cause of, they actually made it better. I mean, we had conversations, we disagreed, we still had mutual respect. And, when I redeployed, I used my law school connections to get him a prime ticket at Obama's inaugural. And as I wrote, He rewarded me for getting him that ticket to the inaugural with a cell phone video, primitive early cell phone video of the Bush helicopter flying away from the White House while he's saying, na, 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 hey, goodbye, and then sent it to me. And I would have expected nothing less. But this was also a guy who would go to church with me every week because, one of the things that's really interesting if you're in a deployed environment, it's almost just a rule that you just don't do stuff by yourself, that you're always going to be with somebody. And he would go to chapel with me every week, even though he was a deep, deep skeptic, because, we just did stuff together. And you compare that to the kind of culture you have now, where, I used to like you, David, but this essay you wrote, I used to think you were a decent person until I saw your Twitter thread, is the contrast could not be more dramatic. But if your friendships are based on that faction, then you hang by a thread. Everybody hangs by a thread because your presence in your community is going to depend on your ability to toe that line, even if you have misgivings, even if you're not so sure, even if people are going maybe in a direction you're uncomfortable with, as opposed to the comfort and the security of, hey, I appreciate you because, just for who you are, even if you change, even if you disagree. And
there's assumption of goodwill there, right? I mean, as opposed to this culture of, I disagree with you, therefore you're a bad person. You said something that I didn't like, therefore I am going to cast you into outer darkness, and I'm never going to listen to you again. That's the social media world. That's the factional world, as opposed to, hey, I know this guy. I kind of know him. I know his family. I know how his mind works, and we can tolerate that. And I think people understand that difference. Although it is easy to forget that your colleagues are not necessarily your friends, and by God, the people that you're following on Twitter are not your friends.
Right. Well, but the thing is, that shared online intensity that can exist, that sort of sense of shared purpose, it can create a facsimile of friendship.
Right.
It can create a kind of, it's a counterfeit version. And that while it's working, while you're rowing all in the same direction, and you're talking about maybe you're having side conversations about your family and side conversations about your career and your job. And you might even share, like, I had a bad health scare or, something like that friends do. But what's hovering it over it all is that shared commitment to the shared point of view, period. Whereas, say, in a friendship like I had with Leo and have with Leo, we recognize we were people of good faith who are trying our best. and in a complicated world, we don't have to agree, I disagreed profoundly with Barack Obama, but to sit there and say, well, only bad people support Barack Obama is absurd. It's absolutely absurd. I supported Mitt Romney in the 2008 and 2012, but to say that only good people supported Mitt Romney is utterly absurd. And so, this kind of existential humility that you should walk through life with, that allows you to say, you know what, people disagree with me and they might be right. They might be right. And so the mere fact of disagreement with me does not mean that you're a terrible person. That is antithetical to the spirit of modern, endless, constant partisan combat that you see online.
Well, also, it depends on whether or not you value the relationship. So if you're online with somebody and they say something you disagree with, if you don't have a real relationship with them, you can flame them. You can say, you can be insulting. Whereas if you are looking someone in the eye or have known someone for some time, you will you will hesitate. I mean, you will think about it, and you will consider perhaps they're right. I thought about this, about how I've obviously being a conservative on MSNBC can be awkward. But when you get to know someone and develop, I think you and I may have just talked about this at one point, develop sort of an assumption of goodwill. Every once in a while, there will be something that I will say to someone who will disagree with me fundamentally. And I can just sort of see in their eyes, they go, okay, I could flame you, but we know each other. And I kind of know that I could interpret it in the most negative possible way. But you and I have talked about this, and I know your values, and therefore, and we're kind of friends. So I'm not going to do that. We're going to have a civil conversation. But that requires that one-on-one contact. I don't know that you can develop that online or remotely.
Very hard.
So has it become, it feels like it's gotten worse lately, and I wonder how the pandemic has played into this. Those numbers that you mentioned about friendship, how much of that is the pandemic, and how much of it is just other cultural, social changes?
Well, I mean, I think the pandemic plays a part. I mean, it's going to be a while before we learn the full effects of the pandemic on each of us. There's going to be a lot of study. There's going to be a lot of trauma that people have endured that it's going to impact them in years going forward. I mean, we have had more than 600,000 people die, hundreds and hundreds of thousands, probably millions with very serious long-term illness. combined with, job losses, combined with all of the upheaval of that year. So we're going to be figuring out the effect on all of us for a long time. But one of the things I think that is true is that, especially when it comes to men, there are just major, significant cultural changes that have meant that sort of that organic, shared experience form of male friendship that comes out of male spaces, these male spaces are just diminishing and narrowing.
Okay, why is that happening? What are the spaces you're talking about?
Yeah. So, for example, it used to be that we had a much larger, relative to the population, and much more male military. So, you look at the Cold War era military with a much smaller American population. It was a much larger military with much more dramatic male to female disparities. So you had, in any given year, say 2 million men going through this kind of classic bonding experience. That thankfully we weren't actually in a shooting war with the Soviet Union, but there were a lot of very tense times. And even in the best and most peaceful of times, the military is a much more kind of difficult experience in most civilian work. So that bonds people together. We've had, the Putnam bowling alone thesis that's been, we've talked about for a long time, where things like sports leagues are diminishing. He used the bowling leagues, for example, diminishing. Also, honestly, workspaces are much more gender diverse than they were, and the kinds of workspaces that the very physical work that was almost exclusively male, a lot of that is going away. So workplace was proportionally more physical and more male. So a lot of these changes, a lot of these are positive changes. I wrote in the piece, you don't want to be facing foreign threats so serious that they require massed infantry and armor formations in Western Europe. We should be grateful that women have increased opportunities economically. Now, some of the other changes are not as great. We want an economy that has decent opportunities for less skilled, less educated workers. And we want people to feel community. And there's a certain way in which modern work with this, that a lot of us in the quote unquote laptop class, we can do our work just as easily and alone in a room like I am now at my house as we can in sort of some sort of sprawling office space. And so a lot of the nature of modern work itself leaves us more isolated. And so basically my theory is that, and what I argue is that all of that sort of natural, organic, just by living, you make friends kind of reality is beginning to change, so that you have to introduce a lot more intentionality into into making friends. And sometimes when you introduce intentionality into it, it also generates artificiality. One of the things, again, in my piece, I talk about the struggle that people have when they're creating men's ministries, because a lot of churches for a long time have recognized that there's this real void in male friendships. And so they're trying to use church as a place where people can make friends, but it's so hard to do it like in this, all right, we're here for a weekend retreat, we're going to make friends. That kind of forced bonding doesn't really work. And so
because male friendships are very different than female friendships, aren't they? I mean, it is harder for men to develop friendships, these kind of organic relationships that you're describing, isn't it?
I think, because
why?
It's just speaking in generalities. So, we know that not all men are the same and not all women are the same. So just with the understanding that we're speaking in generalities, I think part of it is that men develop friendships to a degree different from a lot of women around shared experience, shared challenge, shared sacrifice. So, for example, the kinds of friendships you often get on a football team when you've been through two-a-days together, or, the kind of friendship you build up, like when I talked about with Leo on deployment. And that's when I talk about these male spaces, like these sports leagues, where you may go through a whole season and not, really talk a whole lot about real stuff. But at the end of the season, you feel like, hey, I've got to, we're friends, we're friends. So I think that shared experience, that shared sacrifice or shared hardship is the kind of thing that really bonds men together. And this isn't new news here. I mean, part of the whole purpose, for example, of a boot camp isn't just to provide you with, you don't walk out of boot camp with all of the military skills that you need, but you do walk out of boot camp with an experience of shared suffering and sacrifice and a sense of esprit de corps if it's done well, and a sort of a mental reset if it's done well. But so I do think that's why with men, I think it's then very hard to replace that with a counterfeit of it, or something where you're trying to do it in quickly and intensely. Like, here's a weekend retreat. We're going to all go whitewater rafting, and at the end of it, we're going to all be pals. That's sometimes too fast, right? Or maybe you're super busy because you've got a young family or a busy career, and then there's no follow-up. And so it's that organic, long-term shared experience, shared hardship, I think, that really makes that bond.
Well, I could spend all day talking with you about this particular subject, but let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more from David French. And David, I want to talk to you about critical race theory and the debate about critical race theory when we come back. Hey, Charlie Sykes here. Just a quick reminder, if you sign up for Bulwark Plus, you will have access to our morning newsletters, to JVL's Triad, as well as our whole suite of podcasts. This one will remain free, but if you want to listen to the Secret Podcast or participate in our live streams or others like the Next Level Podcast, please consider joining Bulwark Plus. We're back with our guest, David French. We spent the first half of the podcast talking about friendship. Let's talk about one of the most frustrating debates that I've encountered in a long time, and I think you share the frustration. The whole debate about critical race theory, and I know that you've had some actual one-on-one debates with folks. If I understand your position correctly, which I think is pretty much my position, critical race theory is problematic. It's illiberal, it's intolerant, it needs to be exposed. It is reductionist in terms of racial identity. But right now there is this moral panic and this push to pass legislation around the country banning it, and that's a real problem. I mean, it's so interesting how conservatives who had talked for years about limited government and all of this now are all in on passing these bills, and it's become kind of a wedge issue. So talk to me a little bit about the way this debate has been rolling out and your role in it.
Yeah, and interestingly, it's going to connect with what we were just talking about in an interesting way. So critical race theory, I first encountered it 30 years ago. Actually, August of 1991. I remember very vividly because that was beginning of my first semester of law school. And at my law school, critical race theory, critical theory had overtaken the place. It had just overtaken it. I think 5 of my first 6 major professors were what we called crits, critical legal theorists. And so I've been dealing off and on to greater and lesser degrees with critical theory for 30 years. I've been fighting the excesses of it for 30 years. So one of the early excesses, because everyone acts like, oh, this is brand new. This is never, it just exploded onto the scene. No, it's been around for a long time. And one of the ways it exploded on the scene 35 years ago was through university speech codes. Because you said something earlier, Charlie, about illiberal, there are interesting diagnostic uses that critical race theory has. It has one of the ideas of critical race theory is that a racist system can be perpetuated even if no one perpetuating the system is actually racist. And we can go down that rabbit hole for a while, but which is very interesting and challenging to think through. But its sort of solutions phase is very illiberal. It rejects the classical liberal founding of America. It rejects principles of liberalism, and it rejects Enlightenment rationalism. It rejects all of that. And so when it gets power beyond sort of educating about an idea to change a governmental system, it often changes it in highly illiberal ways, like a university speech code that was designed to readjust the power balance on campus when it came to free speech. And I litigated against those for decades. And so what has ended up happening, though, is that for a lot of reasons, some of them involving the very nature of the internet itself, where if Disney or Cigna has a ridiculous PowerPoint, you can pop it up on Twitter, and everyone can see it. There's an absolute panic about it, just a panic about it that you've seen first emerging online and now moving into the offline world. And the solution to the problems of critical race theory, which I freely and completely acknowledge exist, and not only acknowledge exist, have been fighting against those problematic aspects for decades. The solution itself has problems that is being proposed. And the solution is this idea of, quote unquote, banning critical race theory. At its most modest, the goal is K through 12. When you get to some of the other legislative proposals, public K through 12, it includes public universities. If you talk about the Trump EO, that sort of executive order that launched all of this, it was banning critical race theory even in private government contractors, so private corporations. And so the first thing that you have to understand when you're looking at a law or a proposal to, quote unquote, ban critical race theory is that when you read it, it doesn't ban critical race theory. Critical race theory is a complicated thing. It bans certain defined, quote unquote, concepts. And these concepts in many ways are what I would call a caricature of critical race theory. And then they're drafted in a very sloppy way. So that essentially in Tennessee, they passed a critical race theory ban that bans any attempt to sort of advocate against a creed. So the critical race theory ban in Tennessee bans criticism of critical race theory, a creed. So it's a lot of sloppiness. Well,
it's hard to craft legislation, statutes banning ideas, theories, concepts,
Correct.
Isn't it? I mean, this is sort of the fundamental problem.
Yeah, exactly. That's the problem. And this is something, with the speech code from 30 years ago. Some of the most brilliant minds in higher education tried to craft perfect speech environments based on these critical theory ideas, and they couldn't do it. It was an absolute mess. I mean, some of the language was almost laugh out loud ridiculous. And it's same with the case. There is a statute proposed in Kentucky that is banning formal and informal discussions of the concepts in schools. Formal and informal discussions of the concepts. What? What?
Well, you mentioned before we started the podcast about this law in Tennessee, which is so broad and so badly written that it would ban what? It would. It doesn't ban critical race theory itself. It bans a lot of other things, like what?
All right. So the Tennessee law restricts teaching that leads to, quote, division between or resentment of a race, sex, religion, creed, nonviolent political affiliation, social class, or class of people. So what? Again, how, resentment of a creed, there are lots of awful creeds out there. Communism is a creed. Nazism is a creed. So wait, are we supposed to now say the state of Tennessee requires me to teach Nazism and communism in a way that is not calculated to lead to your resentment?
Value free. So,
yeah.
But in some ways, these laws kind of reflect the politics of all of this. And I know that you had an online podcast debate with Christopher Rufo, who has become kind of the Pied Piper of all of this. And he's been rather transparent in his cynicism that he just wants people to, I think he tweeted at one point that he wants people to pick up the newspaper and see something that they don't like and immediately think, aha, that's critical race theory. So very specifically fudging the boundaries, the borders, and the definition of what critical race theory is into anything that makes them uncomfortable or they find offensive in the discussion of race. So if that's how the debate is being launched, sort of inevitable then that the laws passed based on this kind of push would be this kind of mushy and indistinct.
Yeah, and Charlie, heaven help you online if you say there's problems with these laws.
Right. No, see, this is what I really wanted to get to with you, because we're in a very dangerous period right now. And I think I want to put this in sort of the larger context, that if you try to make the case, okay, this is objectionable, but we don't want to use the state power to crush it, you get attacked from both sides. I mean, there's a pincer movement. And I think this is the problem of small L liberalism and free expression, is that, yes, you do have this troglodyte right, which has its authoritarian streak, but there's also this intolerant left that's out there. And right now, I am really worried. To tell you the truth, David, and I was thinking about what I wanted to talk with you about. There is this pincer movement from the right and the left, and I think that this is, maybe it's not unique, and I'm not claiming that it's historically unique, because it's not. I mean, liberalism and free expression have always been fragile. They've always been maybe a minority creed, but it does feel like we're at a moment of sort of maximum tension and danger, because the consensus about, hey, free speech, you don't burn books, we don't have state legislatures banning theories and concepts, that consensus seems to be eroded.
Yeah, it really does. So what you have you have illiberal right and illiberal left. They feed off each other. In many ways, they need each other and they fear each other. And so what ends up happening is, if they both have very similar views of state power. So, for example, I talked about how many critical race theories reject the classical liberal founding of America. They reject Enlightenment rationalism. Well, you know who else does? Are the post-liberal right. They have written screeds against Enlightenment rationalism, and they've written screeds against classical liberalism. And so these are some of the combatants locked against each other, and they both want to put all of the power in the state to enact their vision. So you can begin to see how these stakes just escalate and escalate and escalate, because they reject, in many ways, individual liberty. They reject the marketplace of ideas. They reject sort of these classical liberal principles of the founding. And so but they really embrace state power. And if they both embrace state power, and although they have the same view of state power, they have diametrical opposite views of each other, then you begin to see why all of this gets so intense, because there is no space for dissent in these worldviews. So the dissenters are treated like people who violate speech codes. On the far left, dissenters are treated like those who violated speech codes in college campuses. On the far right, dissenters, they try to hound dissenters out of the marketplace of ideas. They try to hound dissenters out of workplaces. I mean, cancel culture is alive and well on the right. And these two sides feed off each other. So if you sit there and you say, wait a minute, not only do I oppose critical race theory, but I also don't think that we need to go post-liberal in our attitudes on the right to oppose it, that we have the tools within our classical liberal structure to deal with this. Better curriculum at the local level, for example, get involved locally for better curriculum. And when there are excesses of CRT, then you file a civil rights lawsuit, which protects civil rights laws, protect people both, white, black, Asian, Hispanic. They protect everybody of any race. And that you have the classical liberal tools to deal with this. Unless you're stampeding to illiberalism, an awful lot of people on the far right are going to I'm not just saying disagree with you.
No.
They're going to try to destroy you. They're going to try to end your career.
Yeah. This is really this is the problem. I'm going to talk about this book thing because I think this relates into it. The American Booksellers Association. I'm sure you followed this story. Okay, these are people who I just want to emphasize. They sell books. This is what they do. So one of the books they were trying to sell. Well, I'll get to it in a moment. They put out this statement the other day. An anti-trans book was included in our July mailing to members. This is a serious, violent incident that goes against ABA's ends policies, values, and everything we believe and support. It is inexcusable. We apologize to our trans members and the trans community for this terrible incident and the pain we caused them. Okay, so this serious, violent incident was sending out a copy of a book, okay? The book is Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters by Abigail Schreier, which again is controversial, but it is a book. And here you have the booksellers saying, we really apologize for selling this book because it's violence. I mean, objectively speaking, when the people who sell books cannot make a distinction between books and acts of violence, we are in a dangerous place. And what is interesting is watching all of the pressure to suppress this book, with which you don't have to agree, but it's not how you feel about transgenderism. It's whether you can even talk about it. I mean, Target has removed the book. There's a campaign at Amazon, a big petition where hundreds of employees have demanded that Amazon stop selling it. The ACLU, you want to talk about how small the tribe is now. The ACLU, one of the top officials, a guy named Chase, is it Strangio? He's the deputy director for transgender justice, tweeted, "This book is a dangerous polemic. We have to fight these ideas which are leading to the criminalization of trans life." And then he said, "Stopping the circulation of this book and these ideas is 100% a hill I will die on." This is the ACLU. And then there was a professor of English in California who went further, tweeting, "I do encourage followers to steal Abigail Schreier's book and burn it on a pyre." Okay, so it's like, seriously, people, haven't we been through the whole book burning thing? And yet here we're at. Do you have this massive campaign that if there are ideas expressed in this book that you need to put on sackcloth and ashes and go through the performative wokeness of saying, this is a terrible thing to do. And I got to say that this does strike me as one of those moments where liberalism is very much under siege.
Oh, it's absolutely under siege. And let's connect it to the beginning of our conversation. Why is it that you see such large numbers of people online jumping all in unison onto an issue, and it's almost as if they're competing with each other in the level of vitriol that they can, or the amount of fury that they can vent? I think a lot of this is what you're looking at is the product of factional relationships. And what you're looking at is this is the end result in many ways of these very personal forces that we talked about before. This is where people are finding community. They're finding community in shared animosity. And they're finding community in sort of in that shared animosity against, whether the object is latched onto an idea or the object is latched onto a person. That shared animosity creates a powerful social force in which it is very important for you to signal quite clearly where you stand. Even though, as we both know, that an enormous amount of attention paid to a book does what to the book? It enhances its reach and its sales.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this will backfire unless, of course, they manage to get it taken off all of the shelves. I guess here's the thing: it's not just that you declare your conscience by saying this book triggers me. Just looking at this book triggers me, but you must also be triggered, or else you're a terrible person. I mean, it's the demand that you shared the triggered reaction and that you act on it to prevent anyone else from being exposed to it. And this is these are the kinds of assumptions that I think you and I grew up with, which is that, okay, if you don't like a book, don't read it, don't buy it, or refute its arguments. You don't burn it. And that consensus is badly, eroding, if not gone now, on both the right and the left that we've been talking about. But when you see it coming from the booksellers, and by the way, this whole American booksellers thing, they're responding to the bookstores themselves. All of the members, the bookstores, these are the people that walk around going, "I read banned books." All the freaking time, right? They have the big buttons on all of that. They're the ones demanding, "How dare you even send this to us? How dare you expose me to this book? It's a book."
Yeah. It's really amazing. We have a law of free speech in this country, and it's supported by a culture of free speech. And right now, the law of free speech is pretty solid. In other words, if your ability to protect yourself from state censorship is basically unparalleled in American history. We have your protections against the state trying to, an arm of the government trying to shut you down. Your protections from that are unparalleled, but we're losing our culture of free speech. And so you have to protect both. You can't, you absolutely protect the First Amendment. You don't destroy the First Amendment to save free speech like some people in the post-liberal right want to do. And they don't actually want to save free speech. They just want to save the speech they like. They don't have a particular interest in free speech. But you don't destroy the First Amendment to, quote unquote, save free speech. You preserve the First Amendment, and then you try to preserve a culture of free speech that sustains the First Amendment. And it's getting harder, Charlie. It's getting harder because everyone wants to turn. They not only want to see their opponents silenced, they want to turn to government to try to help make that happen.
No, exactly. And I want to move on to a related topic because somehow this is like, somehow I am connecting the dots here between the formal protections in the law versus the cultural erosion, and which brings me to what we're learning about the possibility of a coup and the role of the military. Again, the system actually worked. We did not overturn the government. There was a transfer of power. It was not a peaceful transfer of power. But I just want to get your thoughts as somebody who's been in the military, what we are learning over the last, 48, 72 hours about how worried top military officials were, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, about whether or not Donald Trump was going to try to stage a military coup. I mean, this is a remarkable story. When it was happening, I was concerned, but now it seems that what we're learning is that it was worse than we thought. Your take on this?
Yeah. So, I saw a lot of people online kind of mocking this story like, oh, Milley, give me a break. How could anyone mock it after January 6th?
Yeah.
Is one thing. And the second thing is all of the people that were mocking it were not as close to Trump as Milley was. Here's a guy who is appointed by Trump, worked under Trump, has seen Trump up close and in person in his decision-making process, is familiar with Trump's character, and he's worried about a coup. Well, you know what? Then I realize, as alarmed as I was in the November, December, January, I feel like somehow I might have been not alarmed enough.
Exactly. That's what Tim Miller and I were saying to each other. It turned out to be way worse than we thought, and we were being accused of Trump derangement syndrome at the time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I was writing in December, like as I was looking at that escalating Christian nationalism rhetoric, that there are people who are going to act on this. Mm-hmm. There are people who are going to act on this. And, people mock you. Are you kidding me? And then January 6th happens. Yeah. One of the interesting things that we've learned is that in a lot of ways, at some point, you can make the best system in the world with the most checks and balances in the world. But at some point, the system is going to depend on people. Just like, in Georgia, the Secretary of State in Georgia, the system gave him the power to say no to the president, right? But it took his own courage and fortitude to then also say no to the president. And we had that in a number of circumstances in this whole election challenge. It came down to individual people. And they were given, thankfully, by our laws, the power to resist the president. They had the ability to, but did they have the fortitude? And that's the thing that's became very clear to me in reading the account by Milley and how they were planning to do a series of resignations. Because at the end of the day, the system was going to depend on people who had the fortitude to resist an unlawful order. It was going to depend on that.
I heard an interview yesterday, and I'm trying to, because I was listening to it on Sirius XM. I didn't see the faces, but it was on television. General McCaffrey and Admiral Stavridis were on talking about all of this. And they both made the point that under our system, the commander-in-chief has tremendous power and does have the power to order the military to do a lot of things. And they said that ultimately what people need to understand is that you can't assume that you're always going to have the people who are going to be making the right decisions there. The only real defense against a president abusing his power with the military is the electorate. The electorate has to put people who are honorable, who are restrained, who have respect for democratic values. And it was sort of like, guys, it worked out this time, but do not count on the military to always resist the commander-in-chief's orders. And I thought that was a very powerful point. When you realize that, in fact, the president of the United States, if he issues orders, if it's not clearly illegal, the odds are pretty strong that that order is going to be followed. And that unless the American people take their responsibility seriously, the military is not going to be the ultimate defender of constitutional norms and democratic values. And I kind of stopped when I was walking back and forth, listening to this, and I stopped. I said, wow, that is a powerful warning from these two guys who have been at the very, very top of the military hierarchy.
Well, and we also have to realize that Trump wouldn't do it where he would just say coup. The way he would do it is he would say there is disorder in the streets, Insurrection Act is invoked. Right. Then I have discovered absolute evidence, and I have certain evidence that the election was stolen, that this is an illegitimate transfer of power. Therefore, I'm going to block an unconstitutional seizure so all of the right buzzwords would be used. And we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that a great bulk of the House would go with it, that the great bulk of conservative media would go with it. We know that this would occur because we already learned that the very idea that there were lines that people would draw that they would not cross was obliterated. It was obliterated. Think how many Republicans continued the election objections after the Capitol was stormed. Right. No lines. Lines.
And now it's become the litmus test, right? It's gotten worse. It was right. Even after everything that happened, everything we've learned, the worst aspects of that lie have now become conventional wisdom in the Republican Party, which is extraordinary. If you and I were talking in the morning after January 6th, saying, what will this do to the Republican Party? How will this change our politics? I'm not sure that I would have said, hey, you know what? By July, everybody's going to be totally cool with this.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I mean, where there is going to be it is going to be harder to be a person by July of 2021. It's going to be harder to be in the GOP and demanding an investigation of the January 6th takeover of the Capitol to stop the lawful transition of power. It's going to be harder to oppose that publicly than it is to just either ignore it or continue to propagate the stop the steal lies. It's extraordinary. And, coming from, and Charlie, I know you're in, a different part of red America than I am. I wonder if this is what you're experiencing. So what I'm experiencing is that here in my neighborhood, when you do the New York Times, what kind of bubble do you live in, put in your address. My neighborhood is 85% Republican. Mm-hmm. So I'm in a pretty deep red place. What I found is that there are fewer Trumpy folks now, but the people who are not Trumpy are checked out. Yeah. It's their response to all of this with the GOP is to essentially not to say I'm not a Republican anymore. They'll still vote Republican, but to say I don't want to be a part of this community. Like I'm out of this. I was talking to a doctor. He said after January 6th, he just stopped looking at social media or cable news entirely, and his life is a lot better, which I don't doubt at all. No. But what's happening is a lot of the much more sensible folks, when they brush up against this intensity and they brush up against this fury, it's like, hitting an electrified fence. They just move away from it. And so what's happening is that's leaving the field to a cohort and a subset of people who are increasingly radicalized, maintaining all of that radicalization. That's right. And that's my experience here. So you have this big group of people who are good folks who aren't like that, but they're increasingly disengaged. And the folks who are really all in are increasingly radicalized.
Right. They're all in, which means, that they have disengaged, but they'll still be supportive. I mean, they'll still
vote.
That's the problem, I think, because they won't push back against this. They won't object to all of this. And that I'm just reading, and I'm sorry to keep going back to this sort of thing, but reading histories of authoritarianism, there is that moment at which people just become numbed. And that's completely fine from the point of view of the people who are pushing the most extreme lines, because that means that they have a monopoly on the debate. They get to set the terms of it, and there won't be any resistance. And I think that is the moment we are at here. So on that happy note, David French, hopefully we will have a beautiful weekend of being checked out.
Yes. Everybody needs time to check out.
I think so. So, David, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. We always appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
And thank you for listening to this weekend's Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We will be back on Monday. We'll do this all over again.